Okay, so I'm going to be talking about this diagram of the brain, which you will ultimately be responsible for knowing on any sort of assessment that you take. And so, in addition to identifying the leader lines, we're going to be doing some coloring, which you don't have to do, but it is helpful to understand in understanding where all of these structures are. The most confusing thing, first and foremost, is that this image of the brain is backwards from the one that is in the PowerPoint presentation. So this is the ventral side or anterior side of the brain right here, and this is the posterior. When it comes to the major lobes of the cerebrum, they are in very similar places to the skull bones. And so you may find that helpful in your identification. So I'd like to do the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes first. So as far as identifying them, if I said that this was the anterior part of the brain, it would either be C or D. C happens to be a different structure, so the best answer here for the frontal lobe is letter D. The parietal lobe is posterior or dorsal to the frontal lobe, and that would be indicated by letter L. And then the temporal, which is in very similar area as the temporal bone of the skull, is indicated here by letter F. So I'm going to go up and fill in these letters. So for frontal, it was D. For parietal, it was L. And for temporal, it was F. Now, if you choose to print this worksheet out and color it yourself, you can do that. What I would like you to do is to use very light colors for the frontal and parietal lobes because they need to have something colored over them at a later point. So I'm going to use yellow for frontal lobe. No, that's not yellow. Choose yellow, like I said, for the frontal lobe. And I'm going to come down and color this whole area here in yellow. It goes right up to structure A, right there, which is the central sulcus. And it comes down. This diagram does a pretty good job of distinguishing the lobes from one another. If I'm going too fast for you, feel free to pause the video and finish that up yourself. Now the parietal lobe, I'm going to use a light green for. And so come back down, the parietal lobe is letter L. And you have some dotted lines between there. And the temporal and occipital lobes can come right up to that central sulcus. And this is the parietal lobe. For the temporal, we'll just use another color and color that region in blue. The only other major surface lobe that we haven't looked at yet here is the occipital lobe. Hopefully you can guess where that belongs at this point. And you're right if you guessed the letter J as the occipital lobe. So I'm going to color it while I'm here in this pink color. And then we'll label it the occipital lobe right over here, number 11, with letter J. And And so I had mentioned before that we needed to identify some structures within the frontal and parietal lobes, and those are the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus. And they are on either side of the central sulcus, and I mentioned that earlier. So the pre-central would be in front of the central sulcus or anterior to it, and the post would be posterior, or post-central gyrus would be behind it. So if we scroll down to look, letter A represents the central sulcus, goes all the way down through here. And then the pre-central gyrus is indicated by letter C, it's right here. And then the post-central is indicated by letter B. So post-central is B, and your pre-central is letter C, and the central sulcus itself is letter A. Now, because these two gyruses, are part of various lobes, we're going to have to indicate them with either dots or stripes for that particular area. So you can choose a different color, and I'll just choose red in this case. And so for my pre-central, I'm going to indicate it with little red dots. So I'd come over here, and all of this area I am going to dot. It's this whole ridge. And then the post-central one, right behind it, you'd want to do something similar to that. So again, choose any sort of color that you'd like. I'll do purple dots, indicate that here. And I'll go ahead and dot this whole region in here. So let's go forward with identifying some other structures. We have a parieto-occipital fissure that we're looking for. Parieto-occipital. So it's in between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. So if we come down, here's the parietal, here's the occipital. And so the fissure is indicated by letter K, which is this line right here, and that separates those two lobes from one another. So we'll put a letter K here for number 5. We have a lateral sulcus as well. So central one went straight down. The lateral sulcus is going to come across the brain. And so it's indicated by letter E. And it is this line, goes all the way through and separates the frontal and parietal from the temporal. The cerebellum, otherwise known as the little brain, protrudes from underneath the occipital lobe. And so that's this whole region right here, indicated by letter I. And so you can color that one as well, whatever color you would like. You do a light pink. The other two structures we have left to identify are parts of the brainstem. We have to identify the medulla and the pons. The medulla is letter H, and then the pons is letter G. H. And the pons is letter G. So we can do the medulla first. Do an orange color or peach color, and that is the lower part of the brainstem right there. And then letter G is the pons, the other part of the brainstem, and I will do a green color for that. I forgot to label the occipital, I did pink. And lastly here is the pons, dark green color. there. And like I had mentioned before, this is the diagram you will have to know for an assessment. So if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to your instructor.